The emotions that we show are calibrating a young person's, particularly a small person, they're calibrating a young person's understanding of what's good and what's bad in the world. The things that make mum and dad joyful, they're obviously good. The things that make mum and dad sad, they're obviously bad. If you love, you're going to feel pain. You're going to feel the pain of the people around you. If we don't raise young people to be souls of prayer, we've wasted our time. And so how do parents teach their kids to love prayer?
There's an invitation for parents really to be cultivating their own rich interior life of prayer, because out of that will flow, I guess, the ability to love and to teach love. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Genius Podcast. My name is Karen Doyle, your host and founder of the Genius Project, an initiative for Catholic women designed to support and resource you towards growth in all areas of life, personal, spiritual, and professional. We do this through the Genius Podcast, the MasterClass, and our coaching programs for Catholic women. If you'd like to find out about any of these initiatives, you can visit our website, www.geniusproject.co, or I invite you to come and join us on Instagram, genius_project_daily, or you can watch the recordings of these podcast interviews on the Genius Project YouTube channel. Just make sure you hit subscribe so that you can be notified every time a new episode drops. Well, ladies, on this week's episode of the Genius Podcast, we're diving into a topic that's relevant particularly for mothers, but I would say relevant for all people. There's so much wisdom in this episode, and we are talking about parenting for character. And today I am joined by Dr. Andy Mullins, who is the author of the book Parenting for Character and the author of the Parenting for Character Workbook. Dr. Andy teaches the Formation of Character course at the University of Notre Dame in Sydney and runs a small university project in Carlton, Victoria. For many years, he was the headmaster of Redfield and Wallamai colleges in Sydney, and he is the author of Parenting for Character, Parenting for Faith, and a newly released discussion workbook for parents called Parenting for Character Applied. His doctorate investigated the neurobiology of character and virtues education. Andy is a very good friend of Jonathan and mine. He's spoken at the Sisterhood Conference in the past, and Andy has so much wisdom to offer in this area of parenting, and particularly how we can grow in virtue and character. So whether you're a parent or not, this episode has so much goodness in it. I hope that you enjoy. Well, Andy, welcome to the Genius Podcast. Wonderful to have you joining us. I've been wanting to have you as a guest on this podcast for a very long time. So God's timing is always perfect.
Karen, good on you. It's good to be here. It's good to be here. And I have so many good memories of our conversations with you and Jonathan. It's lovely.
Yeah, well, us too. You've been a very important person in our life over many years. And you also have played an important role in, I guess, the Sisterhood Catholic Women's Conference, because you were a guest speaker there a number of times talking around parenting for character specifically. And I know the women just were so blessed. You were one of their highlights, actually, at many of those conferences. So it's great to have you back on the podcast and sharing your wisdom. And you've got a couple of books, and one of the books that we're going to be talking about today is this one, Parenting for Character Applied, because you wrote a book many years ago now called Parenting for Character, didn't you? And what year was that published, that first book?
Originally that came out, I think, in 2005.
Okay.
And then it went through a few editions in other countries, including a Thai edition.
Really? Wow.
I have a copy of it, obviously, and it's beautifully illustrated, but I have no idea what it's saying.
What it says. You hope they've translated correctly.
Right. And there's a Spanish edition, and Perusia did a second edition. So that's got sort of updated material, particularly in terms of what happens in our brains, if you like.
Yes. So Andy, can you share a little bit about your background for the listeners, for women who don't know of you or your work?
Yeah. Well, first of all, full disclosure, I'm an absolute hypocrite because I don't have kids, but I write about parenting.
Fantastic. Back in the day when Jonathan and I were giving all of our seminars when we started Choices, it was funny. We used to give all these parenting workshops and we were the experts. And then we had one child and we're like, And by the time we had three, we're like, we're never giving another parenting workshop again. So
I clearly haven't hit that wall yet.
That's funny.
Yeah, so I fell into what I'm doing, really. I started off studying something totally different, and then I was doing some youth work when I was a uni student, and the guy that was running that program I found so I suppose, charismatic, that
Mm.
I actually switched courses and I went into teaching. And and I started off life as I was going to be a maths teacher, and I decided I didn't want to do maths. My maths gene had broken, and then
Okay.
I decided I was going to teach history, and I did a lot of history at uni. But once I started teaching English, I loved it.
Did
So
you?
I spent a number of years as an English teacher, and then I was running Redfield College in Dural for. I started off in the government system, but then when the Parents for Education School started, I I moved to Redfield in 1986. So I'm old.
Okay.
And then
Yeah.
and then and then I took over at Redfield as the headmaster 10 years after that.
Mm.
And and I was the headmaster there for 15 years, which was a beautiful time and beautiful privilege, really, because so many wonderful families around me that I learned a lot from them. And the schools, those parent schools, are quite unique because they have a mentoring program where
Mm.
not only do we guide the children one on one, and and um, and really skill ourselves up for that, but also we meet with the parents, and in a sense, the mentoring program exists for the parents to support
Mm.
them. So, thousands and thousands, literally, of interviews with parents over that time about their children.
Mm.
And, and then from there, I went to Wallamai College in the west of Sydney to be the headmaster there for 4 years. And then 10 years ago, I came down to Melbourne to run a university project. So I've been here and sort of doing different things. But in the process, when I was at Redfield, I did a doctorate in virtue ethics, so philosophy, moral philosophy with neuroscience. So what happens in our
Mm.
brains when we develop character? And obviously, there's a lot of philosophical component of that because you have to demonstrate that we're not just mechanisms; we're actually free and we can make choices. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, that's the background, and that's why I'm across a lot of the neuroscience and the
Mm.
neurobiological changes that reflect the the pathways that we develop through consistent
Mm.
behaviours.
Mm.
Whether they're good behaviours or bad behaviours is the problem. So
Mm.
whatever we do, it leaves a physical imprint in our brain, if you like, and in time we develop pathways of behaviour that certainly are either an express ticket to behave well or they're baggage big time, and we have to
Mm.
find workarounds afterwards if we want to change them. It's
Mm.
an interesting thing that it's very hard to get out of. It's very hard to get out of bad habits, isn't it?
Oh,
Um,
it's so hard. Even though you have that desire,
yeah,
the practical steps in order to break
that's
bad
right.
habits.
Yeah. And
Mm.
you have to almost do a workaround. The pathway's always there, and you can always trigger it again by going back to the bottle or whatever, whatever the issue is. Um,
Mm.
so it's a really interesting field. That's all.
Yes,
Anyway,
it's
so I've
fantastic.
tried
And
to work some of that into the book. And the
yes.
last, I don't know. Do you want to talk about this book for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. Because this one is the application for your book, Parenting for Character.
That's correct. So parenting for character is structured in 4 sections, but basically it's an argument for how important it is in our parenting that we focus, or in raising kids or in teaching or whatever, that we focus on developing strengths of character.
Yes.
And I mean, the Parents for Education schools were doing this since 1980s, right? But it's very interesting to see how there's been this absolute resurgence of virtue ethics.
Mm.
Most prominent being positive psychology. Martin
Yes.
Seligman in maybe 2002, and another psychologist called Peterson. They put out a big tome called Character, Strengths and Virtues.
Mm-hmm.
And and basically he said, look, he was the most famous, he is probably still is the most famous psychologist in the States, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although he's getting on a little bit now. And he said, look, I'm sick of focusing on psychological problems. What we need to do is focus on psychological well-being, and in order to do that, we need to develop good habits in our lives.
Mm. Yes.
And that's another way of talking about virtues. Virtues are good
Yes,
habits.
absolutely. And so important. I think when we're talking about parenting, particularly like our children, when we have young children, they're so impressionable. And as parents, like we are called to be good stewards of their life and the foundations that we lay. And I think if we can get this material to parents at an early, in that early season of parenting,
Sure,
then they can
sure.
really integrate it into, I guess, their parenting and their family life. But even when you have teenagers, it's never too late, or young adults, it's never too
No
late to
fear,
begin.
no
So,
fear. It's
So
a big challenge, isn't it, to sort of set up the right structures almost to not
yes,
let life take over. And because
and life has a way of doing that. I
you
mean,
know
I'm
very
a mum of three teenagers, and it just does.
absolutely.
Yeah.
People are run off their feet when they've got little kids, and
Yes.
when they've got older kids, they're still catching up. It's crazy.
Oh, well, I would say because we couldn't have children for 6 years. We prayed and prayed, and then we had three kids in 3 years. We said to the Sisters of Life, please stop praying just for a little bit. And like it was an intense season because I threw up through the whole pregnancies with each of the children, and then each of them had reflux, so they didn't sleep the first year of life. And I thought, oh my goodness, I cried for 6 years to feel like this. But then they grew up and it was very busy. And they all started sleeping after they turned one. And then there was a bit of a sweet spot there. But at the start of this year, I feel like we've got a 16, almost 17-year-old, 15 and 13-year-old. And we've just entered into a whole new season of parenting that personally I would say I was not prepared for. I wasn't prepared for the drastic shift going into parenting adolescents, even though this is an area that Jonathan and I both work in and have done for
Yeah,
many years.
sure,
So there's
and effective. Yeah,
yeah, and different chapters of parenting. And I think if we can educate and equip parents before they reach that next chapter or that next season, then we understand what's actually required in that
yeah.
season.
It's
I'm
really
finding,
important. Yeah, yeah. Because
yeah,
kids, you see this more than I do at firsthand, right? But kids change on the inside before it's
mm,
apparent on the outside. And
that's true.
and
Yes.
if parents are behind the wave, all it causes is resentment. And
Mm,
somehow we've got to understand that there's a lot happening inside the mind of this young person who still seems to be playing with
mm,
figures
yes.
and Barbie dolls and Warhammer boys, and all this sort of stuff. I mean, in the end,
Yes.
we've got a young teenager in our hands and we don't realize. It's very interesting.
It is interesting, and particularly also the difference between the genders, despite the culture that
Mm,
we're living in telling us there are no differences, but there's very distinct differences, and
yeah,
we have two girls and a son in the middle, and it's interesting parenting him at the moment. I'm having to learn a lot more about what it means to parent a son, and how my motherhood needs to shift and change in different ways. It's interesting. So yeah, it's an interesting journey. And then I guess when you're launching your children, that's a whole new season. Then when
yeah.
they have their own children. So Andy, I'm really keen for you to shed light on your book because you wrote this book, Parenting for Character, which we read. It was really helpful. But now you've released this one, The Parenting for Character Applied. It's really a manual, isn't it, to help parents put into practice all of these ideas.
Yeah. I suppose my vision of how this could work, yes, as it's divided into, 9 or 10 chapters, if you like, and each of those chapters has a mix of um, exercises for mums or dads to sit and think about and reflect on, or to
Mm,
talk together about, or tick lists, or um, little case studies that they can put their minds to, or topics to bring friends over and have a discussion on a particular topic related to either fostering a particular strength of character or auditing their own unity as a couple, which I think is really important. That's the first
mm,
step, really, to see that mum and dad are quite united. They have the same vision for their kids, and they
mm.
realise their example is everything. Um, so I suppose my vision for this is that um, if mums and dads can get into a habit of doing an exercise a week,
Okay.
maybe over a glass of wine on a Sunday night after the kids have
Mm,
sort of clocked off. Um, sounds idyllic. Um,
mm.
and
Trying to build that practice
trying
into.
to have a habit and just tick, sort of start to work through. It's a skill builder. I'm talking about it as a skill builder, and some people may feel it's going back to school a little bit, but I think there's such a variety of, of of topics and approaches here that I don't think it's onerous in that sense. I think it's
Mm,
actually got um, a lot of new angles that people will find very interesting. So typically,
mm.
just looking at the topics, for example, um, the first idea I love to push, and I'm talking about a lot these days, is it's a quotation actually that came from a priest who's now blessed in the Catholic Church, Blessed Alvaro del Portillo. But he says, "Don't forget that your family is a school of love, and
Yes.
the central task of parents is to teach their children to love." And I mean, maybe we wouldn't have been able to say this before John Paul II, because John
Mm,
Paul II talks so much about how we're fulfilled in truth and in love. And obviously that's timeless Catholic teaching, but the reality is, it's in a sense, it's been rediscovered. And if our families are to be schools of love, that obviously means that mum and dad have to really audit their own example, and that's crucial. But also, there's particular strengths of character we need if we're going to be effectively living for others, if we're going to orient our lives to others. So I keep coming back to that idea, and how do we? What's the most important quality you want to raise in your kids? I mean, you can talk about sincerity, or you can talk about humility, or whatever, and all of those things are crucial, and we talk about that in the book. But probably the biggest single one is that they are oriented outwards, that they know how to be grateful, they know how to pay attention to other people, they know how to be kind, they know how to be generous. Because if they don't have those qualities of orientation towards others, they won't know how to love, and that's tragic.
It is. And there's such a wound at the moment. I mean, we see it in the work that we do. We're doing a lot in this area of sex ed. They call it sex education, but as Catholics, we actually call it an education in love, because
That's
we're
right.
trying to
That's right.
school young people in what it means to love authentically. And I think this is something that's been lost in a lot of Catholic schools, even, is this
Yeah.
idea. We're not just doing sex ed, but we're providing an education in love.
It's
And
such an important distinction. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And I think how you start the book is so, I love that this is a school of love. The family is the school of love. I mean, sometimes it doesn't feel like that, but we have three kids very close together, and it's not all bliss and roses all the time.
I know. Sorry, the
Oh,
bar is very high. You know that.
oh dear me. And sometimes, and I have to say, and I'd love you to speak into this for a moment, because as women, I think generally mothers carry a sense of never quite living up to that bar. There's always a sense of inadequacy, or we could be doing more, or, like I think that's very common experience to many women.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'd love you to just speak in before we move further. There are also a lot of women that I work with whose heart is for all this material, but their husbands might not be practicing the faith, or they might not want to come to the table with this. Can you just speak into that experience for a moment before
Good
we
work.
dive
Good.
deeper?
Yeah, I think Virtuous is a good bridge, isn't it? Because everybody talks this language of strength of character. Everybody wants their kids to be able to stand on their own feet confidently. They want them to be able to relate to others effectively. So essentially, this is a book about building strengths of character.
Mm,
So in that sense, it will engage every parent.
mm,
I don't think I've never met a parent who didn't want to be the best parent they could be, even though sometimes it doesn't turn
mm,
out being the case, right? Um, and now, fortunately, with all these books on good habits now, or Seligman, or whatever, um, this is popular language.
mm,
It's something that everybody talks. Virtue is no longer a sort of old Victorian idea that's out of date. It's something which people understand. Um, so I think in that sense, it's very good to engage mums and dads. I think there's also a sort of, even, I'm thinking of the many parents, or at least the parents that I've had a lot to do with, who've been separated, and I've been
mm,
teaching their kids. But you would say to those parents, listen, um, life can take us in strange directions sometimes, but in everything related to your kids, you have to be united. Otherwise, they will
mm,
be confused. So
mm,
that's a simple message that I think is really important for every parent, that it
mm,
doesn't matter how we may have our disagreements and differences, but in front of the kids, we have to be consistent, because otherwise they're going to get very mixed messages, and that
mm,
wreaks havoc. Um,
mm.
mm,
Yeah. Fantastic. Andy, well, can you take us through this book, and the skills? And I love that you're building skills in people, because I think for so many Catholics, they have the faith formation part, but often
mm.
we're lacking the human formation, the actual practical skills of how do we live a life of self-gift, and how do we
Yeah,
school our kids in love? Like, because there are very practical skills, and sometimes parents haven't actually experienced that from their own parents. So they're coming in to parenting
yeah.
without the skills. So can you take us through what are some of the most important skills that you highlight in the book?
Karen, I'm really good that you're spotting the essence of the thing, because you're right that yeah, we've got the human is the foundation for the spiritual, and if we don't get that right, then afterwards even think of the virtues. Think of the virtue of prudence, right? I mean, prudence or sound judgment, is one of the 4 cardinal virtues, and there's a chapter on it here about how do you. It's the most important virtue for teenagers. Your teenagers will have to run their own lives. They have to think clearly about the world that they're in, so that they can make the right goals for themselves. And prudence comes down to living in reality and being able to set goals for ourselves. And kids need lots of exercise setting goals. I think of one silly story, right? One of my students in Redfield, his dad walks into his room when he's going into year 11, and he's got up on his wall in front of his desk the number 99. And Dad reads the play, and he says to his boy, "Oh, mate, do you think it's realistic? Do you think you will get 99 in your HSC?" And the boy says to his dad, "Dad, I need a goal."
Wow. There you go.
And this young guy, neither his teachers nor his parents thought he would get more than 80, right? He loved surfing. He was a delightful young man, but he didn't work very hard. In year 11 and 12, he'd set himself the goal, and his parents had raised him to set goals for himself. He'd set himself the goal, and he got 98.6.
Oh, wow.
It's
Fantastic.
crazy, right? It's crazy.
Yeah, amazing.
But because it was his goal, he worked his tail off. And now he's done very well professionally. It's beautiful to see, right? What's going on? So how do you raise kids to set their own goals? Another nice story. And some of these stories are in the book in the sort of lead sections of text at the start of each chapter. But another true story, another beautiful story from when I was at Wallamai, that there was a family there that I think everybody admired. The boys were fantastic young men, they were the captains of their classes and super sportsmen and soccer players and runners, and very popular with staff and kids. And I actually asked the dad one time, "Hey, what's your secret?" And he said, when the oldest was in year 7, and he was in year 12 at that stage, when so-and-so was in year 7, he did something I wasn't happy with. So I spoke to him about it. And he's a big man, but he never raises his voice. He's calm, he's quiet, but speaks with lovely, affectionate authority. And he said, "I was so proud of my boy because he had tears in his eyes when I was speaking to him." And then he said, and the same behavior came back a week later.
Oh, dear.
And I'm thinking, this is not my son's fault. This is my fault. I need to give my boy more support. So he said from that moment on, he started having a chat every week with each of his children, one-on-one, helping them set their goal for the week. And 6 years later, we saw the result. He helped them to have their own goals so that they grew. It's very beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah, beautiful. And not just to achieve, but to grow.
That's right.
Personal growth. Yeah.
And that's the whole, there's a beautiful quote from Plutarch about, I think it's the best description of growing up in the business. And he says, look, growing up is not an abandonment of rules, but a change of ruler. And what's that mean? It means we have to set our own rules from now on. We have to know how to set our own goals. We have to know how to. One teacher put it, he's talking to year 12s at one of the schools that I was at, and he said, "Listen, guys, up until now, your parents have put the Great Wall of China around you, but now you have to put your own Great Wall of China." It's sort of, in the end, you've got to be strong. You've got to think, what are you going to let in, and what are you not going to let into your life?
Yeah. And it's the consistency too. I find that piece that it's very easy as a parent to have good intentions for 1 or 2 weeks, and then life gets busy, and it kind of you're not as consistent. And my sister, she's a fabulous mum. Like, she is consistent day in, day out, no matter how she's feeling. She's such a brilliant mother. And I see that consistency piece just reaping, beautiful fruit in her children's lives. Yeah, so
Down here,
consistency.
exactly. Down here in Melbourne, a parent just told me, like last week, he's got 2 boys who are teenagers, and they were causing him some grief. And he said to me, I started talking individually with each of my boys about a year and a half ago, regularly, and it's changed everything. Isn't that lovely? And
It's
he's kept it up.
beautiful. Yeah. And I think it's that connection piece that they long for. Like my kids often will reflect now, we hated COVID, but they will reflect, oh, Jonathan and I hated it, but they will reflect how they wish they could go back to that because we had so much time together. And
Yeah,
there's this yearning, even as
yeah,
teenagers, I find they don't necessarily want you in their space all the time,
yeah,
but they
yeah,
definitely want you around.
yeah,
And so I'm trying to carve out that time for each of them, as you're saying, to just touch base and to have beautiful conversations. And sometimes it takes a little while to get down to, to
yeah,
plow the depths of their hearts when they're eventually vulnerable. And it inevitably, unfortunately, it's always when I'm desperate for an early night, but
yeah.
the house is quiet, bedroom's dark, I'll go in and say goodnight, and you could be in there for an hour.
And that's the
Um,
time. Good on you.
it's
Yeah.
such a sacred time, but
It's
I think
interesting.
there's
If
a
you want to raise kids to be generous, you've got to be generous. It's amazing, isn't it?
oh
It's lovely.
yes, that's true. That's true. Thanks. You just convicted me right there, Andy.
You're doing it.
I'm doing it sometimes a little begrudgingly. I could be a bit more gracious, but no, look, I do. I've always seen bedtime as a really sacred time of the day for the kids and trying to
Yeah.
be available for them. But yeah, it's challenging, isn't it? But I think what you're giving us is some hope and some little ideas. So can you share with us some others? You've talked about
Yeah.
prudence and the need for prudence,
Mm.
which I
This,
think
I
is
mean,
such a big one for teenagers.
it's a big one. Yeah. Um, a, a, a big impact on me was going across to a course in the States a long time ago. I was sent across by the
Okay.
board of the Parents for Education Foundation. And it was a guy called David Isaacs who wrote one of the first really seminal books about character education. It was called Character Building. And it was a week-long course, and it was called Parents and Their Teenage Children. And he talked about how um, um, parents pass on their values, not their behaviours, to teenagers
Mm,
very often. And and so it's really important for us to audit our own values. What's really driving me is am I actually a bit materialistic in the way I approach things? Because that's the opposite of helping kids to live for others. Um,
mm.
um, I find it fascinating. I like coming back to um, um, Book of Deuteronomy. Book of
Okay.
Deuteronomy has this section right at the start where I don't know if it's at the start, but it's Moses talking, and he's got all the
Mm,
chosen people in front of him, right? And he says to them, "Listen, you got to love God with everything you've got, heart and soul and mind and strength." And then we all know that section, and our Lord quotes it. But what comes next? Next comes, he says, you've got to make sure that you never forget this, and that you talk about it at home and you put it on your walls and you talk about it around the dinner table, that we've got to love God with everything we've got.
yeah.
And that you wear it on your clothing and you wear it on your foreheads and you put it on your doorposts. So when you come in and out of home, you remind yourself. So Moses, it's like super psychology that we've got to keep
Mm,
reminding ourselves of the most important things in our lives. And that's why we put
mm,
beautiful pictures of wedding days around the house, right? Because we're reminding ourselves of these beautiful realities that are part of our
mm,
lives. But then, do you know what comes next? He says, when you go into the land of milk and honey, you'll be surrounded by so many distractions that you will be tempted
mm,
to forget that you need to love God with everything you've got. And
mm,
we're in the land of milk and honey. We've got everything we need in Australia, right? We've got all
mm,
the milk is all the stuff we need, and honey is all the sweet bits, and
mm,
and why are we in an increasingly atheistic country? And because we've got so distracted that we're living in the moment, and um, we're not letting our memories remind us how much we owe God and how do
mm,
we get here? We even people here. I'm living with students here, and some of the students don't even obviously World War II or something else, but even relatively recent history they don't know about Rwanda, for example. I mean, and
mm.
it's an interesting problem. I mean, once we once we don't study history and in the world, then we make the same mistakes again. But once we don't know the great things that have happened in our own lives, I mean, our baptism, for example, then what's our Lord say in that? Sorry, I'm being a bit too theological here for
No, this
parenting
is
talk,
good. This is
but
good.
think about what the priest says in the consecration, and he says, um, um, "This is my body that will be given for you." And then he says, "Do this in memory of me." He's saying, "Look, please go to mass frequently because this is the way that you remember that I've died for you."
Mm. Yeah.
And yet we concoct all this other stuff about, ceremonies and stuff. No, it's so that we remember that our Lord has done all this for us, and
Yes.
obviously we can receive communion.
Yes.
Sorry, back to the book. Back to the
No,
book.
no, it's good. I think that's so important, like the idea of the memories, and because we can become really bogged down by how toxic this culture is, how godless it's becoming. And I think for parents especially, like they're contending with forces and things that parents in
Yeah,
previous generations
yeah,
didn't. You just take
yeah,
technology and mobile phones, right there, gaming. They're
yeah,
contending with such powerful forces. So I think there's an invitation for parents really to be cultivating their own rich interior life of prayer, because out of
100%.
that will
Yeah,
flow, I guess, the
yeah,
ability to love and to
yeah,
teach love.
yeah,
So there's a real invitation for
yeah,
parents, I think,
yeah.
to be.
I would like to come back to that idea of prayer in a few
Mm,
minutes because
mm,
because to me that's the most important ingredient in
yeah.
raising kids. That we raise kids so that they learn how to pray with all of their heart.
Mm,
But
yeah.
let's come
Yeah,
back to
we'll come
that
back to that. Okay,
because
take
I
me
want to talk
through.
for a minute. Can I talk for a
Yes,
minute about this
please.
theme of joy and
Yeah.
how life can get on top of us sometimes, right? There's a chapter in the book called "Fix Your Face," and
Oh,
"Fix Your Face"
I
is
can't remember that one. I need to go back and read it. Oh, yes,
It's
yes.
chapter 4, Fix Your
4.
Face. And now what's it about? I mean, in fact, I gave the script to some friends to get people to look at it and tell me what they thought. And actually, one of the couples that I gave it to said, "I changed that," but I left it there,
Good.
and I left it there deliberately because in that chapter, I'm focusing specifically on the emotional example that parents give their kids,
Mm,
because what are the virtues? The virtues are not just sort of nice abstract ideas. Two of the virtues, temperance and fortitude, are about managing our emotional reactions.
mm.
The
Yes.
way that we look for things that we enjoy, or the way that we avoid things we don't like, which is fortitude, right? Or that we know how to do difficult things for a good reason, right?
Mm,
So our emotional example, like the 200 square centimeters or whatever this is, right?
mhm.
That's your first teacher, and we have to try to consistently, as much as possible, get that right. And it doesn't mean always having a beaming smile. It might mean when something serious is happening, showing that no, this is making me sad. That's fine. But the emotional example we get is a crucial teacher, and little kids
Mm,
particularly because they learn their emotions from copying our emotions. We know enough about
yes.
emotion now and how it's learned. So, um, in other words, the emotions that we show are calibrating a young person's, particularly a small person, they're calibrating a young person's understanding of what's good and what's bad in the world. The things that make mum and dad joyful, they're obviously good. The things that make mum
Mm,
and dad sad, they're obviously bad. And this holds until about teenage years. And then
mhm,
after kids become teenagers, they start to be a bit more circumspect. And I've seen this happen, unfortunately, in surveys and things that I've given kids in one of the schools I was at. And and once kids flipped into adolescence, if mum and dad were not happy with them, formerly they would blame themselves. But once these kids were teenagers and mum and dad were cranky with them and they were explicitly angry, the kids would blame their parents for losing it.
mm.
It's
Wow.
interesting issue. Yeah.
Mm,
So our
yeah.
emotional example is not only teaching the kids what's important, but it will either help or obstruct the relationship. And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
we do have to fix our faces. We've got no choice.
Fix your face. I like that. I'm very convicted. Some days I'm not traditionally a morning person. Jonathan gets up at 4 a.m. I'm like, I never understood that. But so it takes me a little while to come online. But I remember you actually speaking about that at a sisterhood conference, and I was convicted just about the smile and being joyful in the morning. And
That's
that's
funny. You've got
something.
a silly story. Do you want a silly story?
Yeah, I love silly stories, please.
This is a friend of mine who's really really out there in Sydney, right? And and uh, and his little daughter did something silly, right? And he went into the laundry and he washed his face and he said, "I'm not going to lose it with my daughter. I'm not going to lose it." And he composes himself and he gets himself under control
Yes.
and he steps out of the laundry and immediately his daughter jumps behind mum and says, "Daddy's got the face." He thought he'd fixed his face, but he hadn't.
He hadn't. Oh, golly. Wow.
So, sometimes there's a lot of subliminal stuff happening that
Yes.
we're oblivious to,
Yes. Yeah.
and
And
that's
kids are so
yeah.
attuned to our emotional state. And it's a good message and reminder for us as parents just to be mindful. I think, sometimes the kids would say to me, "Oh, you don't have to, you're being rude in how you're speaking." I'm like, "Oh, am I? I didn't realize."
And it's funny. I mean, I know the older I get, the harder you got to work at connecting with young people. It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the generation gap thing is interesting, right? I mean, the Romans wrote plays about generation gap. It's not a new
Yeah.
thing, right?
That's right. That's it.
But all that said,
Oh,
it's an interesting challenge, right? We have to know how to come to the level of people and
yeah.
really engage with them in the things that they enjoy too. I mean, one of the best bits of advice I ever got from a fellow teacher was um, it was about helping parents, but he said, look, encourage dads to do things with their sons that they both enjoy.
Mm,
Because
mm.
it's no good dad saying, I really enjoy this. Come with me, boy. That won't work.
And he doesn't enjoy it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a good one. And I love that. Just a reminder of joy, trying to cultivate an atmosphere and a spirit of joy
Mm.
despite circumstances. I think is a really good lesson for
Yeah.
families. Good lesson for us too. So tell me, take us through the next few chapters, Andy,
Good,
because
good,
it's
good,
it's
good.
just it's great. It's such good stuff.
So the way this is structured, sorry, a bit of an overview. So
Mhm.
is your family a school of love? And there's different exercises there. There's
Mhm.
there's a family meeting to write a family mission statement. There's a sort of test to help parents audit what are they really looking for with their kids. There's points about reflection. There's looking at what are the priorities in our day to day. There's a case study. Um, there's a whole lot of points there that one of the features about the book is that it brings together a lot of material that's come from other people's families
Mm.
because we would keep these things constantly in front of the parents
Yeah.
in the schools that I was teaching at. We would collect the best wisdom and recycle it, if you like. So a
Mm.
lot of that is recycled into the book. This book
Mhm.
couldn't exist if it wasn't to the schools I taught at.
Okay. Yeah.
There's topics for discussion. There's topics for mum and dad to share from the heart with each other. There's little logos which the designer did, which are quite nice. You'd like this with your
Yeah, I
design
liked it.
experience, Andy,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
no,
then
it's beautifully
take
laid out.
there's a number of tests that you do and you score yourself to see how you're going. Um, there's and I tried to put as many. I love quotes, so I put as many quotes as I could. Uh,
Yeah. And they're
um,
great. Those just capture the essence of what you're sort of communicating, which I love as well. Can you,
so
sorry?
yeah, so in terms of structure, so first of all, audit the family and how
Mm.
you're approaching your parenting. Second one is unity between mum and dad, and so there's some
Mm.
real soul searching things for both mum and dad to look at there to see if they really are attuned to each other. Um, then the third one is about claiming the space, which is a Jonathan expression. When
Yes. Yeah.
I took this from Jonathan, when Jonathan gave the 25th anniversary talk at Redfield for the parents on the 25th anniversary of the
That's
school,
right.
Jonathan used this expression, claim the space. And
Reclaim the
and
space. Yeah.
yeah, and that's there. And that's where I got it.
Oh, beautiful. There you go.
And you know that in Parenting for Faith, the book just
Mhm.
prior to this, the
Yes.
book starts with a quote from Jonathan, right?
I know. I did see that. That was really beautiful, Andy.
No, I'm
Yeah.
grateful.
Oh, well, thank you. Feel honored.
And then we go from there, from the emotional example, we go into the four cardinal virtues. And this thing of cardinal virtues is important because it sounds like a sort of, oh, why do we talk about four cardinal? There's all sorts of ways to approach virtue. And why are we talking cardinal virtues? Um, I mean, the philosophical reason is that it's the best way of understanding virtue in
Mm.
terms of what a human being needs, because Aquinas plugged the virtues into a human psychology, and he simply said, look, each of our powers needs its own habit, and that's
Mm.
why we have four cardinal virtues, because we have intellect, we have the power of choice, and we have this desire for pleasure and this desire to avoid pain, which in every psychology book is still valid, right? It's
Yes.
very interesting. And so those four powers that we have um, each need their own corresponding virtue. And that's why we have
Mm.
temperance, fortitude, justice, and prudence.
Yes.
And And it's not enough just to talk about fortitude, is it? Sometimes you think, oh, the ancient Greeks used to leave their children on hillsides, so if they survived the night, then they were fit for
They were
life.
fortified. Yeah.
Oh.
Oh gosh.
but but it's not about having the loudest war cry. It's not about being macho. It's what am I going to use my strength to do? Am I going to use my strength to love, or am I
Mm,
going to use my strength to feather my own nest? We're
mm,
full of corporate executives in our world who are using all of their strengths to
mm.
feather their own nests. I mean,
Yeah.
sorry, that sounds very socialist, but but it's
Yeah.
what do we
Mm,
use our justice for? What do we
mm,
use our fortitude for?
mm.
If it's not at the service of love, then it's a waste of time. In Redfield, we got a Canadian philosopher to come out, a guy called Donald DeMarco, quite a while ago. He'd written a beautiful book called Heart of Virtue, which was a series of really edifying stories, but with a fantastic preface at the start, which was the argument was simply through the virtues we deliver love. And if we don't have
Mm,
if we don't have the box and dice of virtues, we don't know how to love people.
mm,
Um, we end up very
mm.
self-centered.
No, that's great, Andy. It was funny. Yesterday, I was at it was a huge Christian educators conference, and it was a policy forum on a lot of the issues that are facing us in religious freedom and discrimination at the moment. And it was funny, at the end of the day, I was up in the restaurant area because I had half an hour to kill before I went on to pick up kids. I was just trying to do some emails. And there was a woman who sat down next to me, and I got up to thank one of the speakers because he'd given an input and we were chatting, and she'd been watching me. And I sat back down, and then she just leaned across. She goes, "What do you do?" And then we talked for the 30 minutes. I didn't end up getting any work done. But she was a flight attendant, and she was in transit. She was 60 years of age, and it was so beautiful. She said, "I've been watching you and I've been trying to work out, is she a corporate woman? Is she a mother? What is she?" So she had come up with this whole story about my life, which was quite funny. She was very normal, not weird. But we started talking just about that balance, because I started sharing, just, sometimes I feel quite torn in terms of working and mothering, and just the tension that exists there. And she was just, it was truly a divine encounter, because she just spoke all this encouragement and
Mm,
wisdom about motherhood. But she made the point just around that sort of corporate thing about giving of yourself to your children. So she wasn't actually a Christian, but she was
yeah,
talking this language of self-gift and being fulfilled in that self-gift. And yeah, it was just really beautiful. I just walked away from it. Thank you, Lord. Like, you're encouraging me that I'm doing all right. Keep going.
that's really nice. That's
Yeah,
very nice.
but I thought it was really interesting, the language that she was using. So she'd been big corporate executive, and then her marriage had broken down. She ended up being a flight attendant. Yeah, so
Wow.
she was just sharing her regrets and
Wow.
just that tension. So yeah, it was interesting
And
conversation.
it's isn't interesting because we're raising kids. Like sometimes the attitude in our society is we've got to avoid things that are difficult,
Yes.
and rule number one: if you love, you're going to feel pain. You're going to feel the pain of the people around you. Um, so that's actually not the most important value that we're trying to pass on to children. That they need
No,
to make life as pain free as possible.
that's
Um,
right.
and somehow um, we've got to know how to put ourselves in other people's shoes. I mean, that your heart goes out to this poor woman who's gone back into the workforce.
Mm,
Her relationship's broken down, and it's a difficult gig, right? And and yeah, how do we raise kids so that they know how to put themselves in other people's shoes?
mm,
Because otherwise, there's no love. It's a tough one.
yes. Yeah, it
Um,
is.
um,
Andy, I'm wondering, just as we're talking there, you mentioned something about kids avoid doing the hard things. And I think this is so true, that there's a real lack of resilience in young people these days. Can you speak into, I guess, how parents can raise kids to be resilient? Because I think the whole culture is just, everywhere you look for young people, it is
good,
about making life easier,
good,
building your
good,
own nest. How can
good.
we raise kids of resilience?
Okay, couple of thoughts. One is make sure that the reason is right. And the reason is that why do we want to be resilient? In order to love others. So we've got to be focused outwards. Um, one of the reasons people collapse is because they're focused inwards. and they're worried. They become victims. They become people really concerned about. They have gripes, and they don't know how to forgive. They don't know how to, because they've forgotten life is forgiving.
Yes.
There's an elderly priest now, Father Jerry Garinger in Sydney, who was one of the first school chaplains, and he said, look, when I grew up in the 1950s in Milwaukee or something like this, we used to hear often that life is for giving, to give of ourselves. But we don't hear that anymore, he was saying. I thought, yeah, that's a really good line. So to me, that's one of the big secrets of resilience, that we look outwards and we rely, and we don't make too much of our own challenges. That's the first thing. And obviously that's got to be part of the fabric of the home. Barbara Holbrook, who launched the first book, Barbara Holbrook was this fantastic children's court magistrate. She's a delight. She's passed away now. She was epic. She was on television at times. She came up to the lectern when she was launching Parenting the Character originally in 2005. She waves her walking stick around and she says, look, this is a walking stick. I'm not deaf. People think when you have a walking stick, you're deaf.
Good on her.
She was great. She was rampant. But she talked about, why should children be happy if parents complain about their lot? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that is.
So we've got to eliminate in our own homes complaint, because that it's raising kids up to fail, to fall. That's the first thing. The second big thing is mum and dad united, raising the bar. So every time, as a child is a year older than the year before, they can do more. And a golden rule in all education is children rise to our expectations. So we've got to keep raising the expectations. Do you remember in rugby league, there was a guy called Jack Gibson who was like a legendary rugby league coach?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Jack Gibson had this expression. He said, it's amazing how high some parents put the bar for their kids and how low they put it for themselves.
That's interesting.
Of course, the kids they're never going to jump that hurdle if they don't see their parents jumping the hurdles.
No, and interestingly, Andy, last a couple of weeks ago, obviously I've been doing all the driving because Jonathan's had his accident, and I was at the post office just saying I'm praying for rain tomorrow because I had 2 soccer games, different sides of town. And this woman behind me, she goes, oh, thank goodness my kids don't play sport. They're gamers. I'm much happier for them to sit on the screen. I thought, oh, wow.
Yeah, that's another story, that one.
Funny. I thought despite how hard it is, we might have to have you back for how to deal with screens. But despite how hard it is, I'm grateful to be serving them. And it is that service. I sort of use that language with kids that we're serving and doing that. Because also just jumping in there is this entitlement in our culture. And we're seeing that with young people a lot. And I think, educating them with habits, virtues, and this language of character is so important to counteract that entitlement culture that they're just marinating in.
Yeah. Think of the dynamic of how a habit is developed. A habit is developed by repetition, and neurologically we understand how that works. We're reinforcing a pathway, but it's not only that. We're reinforcing. It's not just pathways of behavior, it's expectations for enjoyment in particular activities that we've reinforced that expectation. And there's a whole pleasure system in the brain that is activated when we even think of things that we want to do. When we think of things that we enjoy, our pleasure system kicks in and it motivates us to do that, to eat or whatever it is, right? Or to go for a run or whatever. So the way that habits are developed is by repetition of small behaviors. So how can parents help their kids develop good habits? First of all, is get the motivation right, that the whole purpose of this is so that we can better serve others. So that's the underlying conviction. But then things like timetables, jobs in the house, consistency in terms of our own responses and actions, consistent expectations every day. That kids have they know what they need to do, and they do it for the sake of the family. They've got a job to do, and the jobs get reviewed regularly, or there's a roster or something like this. These sorts of little things, they do so much to painlessly build up a resilience in young people. Work is a school of resilience, as in schoolwork, but but we've got to find ways to do this in a way that doesn't become so burdensome that, in the end, the kids just throw the towel in,
Yeah, that's
Um,
right.
I'm, I'm thinking of teenagers too. It's a whole new ball game, isn't it?
Yeah, please share your
It's-
wisdom.
well, I mean, the only, obviously we've got to be ahead of the wave, and we can't keep treating teenagers as if they were, 10 and 11. Um, remember that the big single new challenge in teenage years is the whole education in love thing, right? And 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 the probably the biggest single thing that'll bring mum and dad closer to their kids is if mum and dad have been confident to have regular chats with children, preparing them for their teenage years. You can teach little kids self-control all you like, but that doesn't really play into the sexual sphere. So it's
Yes.
quite important that kids are also prepared with really heartfelt, trusting conversations with mum and dad, where mum and dad open their hearts too. It's not just a matter of telling kids things. It's got to be a two-way, trusting conversation. Um, the best book I know there is Jared O'Shea's "As I Have Loved You." Um,
Yes.
it's a beautiful program where there's a video that goes with it on Vimeo, that parents can simply just Google it and find it. But his vision is parents talking with their kids weekly, and he's got a whole curriculum there for parents to do that, and it's gold.
Yeah.
So the first thing is, I suppose, about teenagers is to understand that the whole challenge in teenagers is hopefully the habits of self-control and not throwing tantrums and things and all of that. That's sorted hopefully by the time that kids are teenagers. But the big challenge in teenage years is to form their convictions and keep throwing the ball at them so that they set goals for themselves and review what they did. Think about. Sorry, I come back to this a lot, and you might
No,
have heard this before, Karen, but think about the only scene that we see um, in the New Testament of how to raise teenagers. Um, it's Mary and Joseph, and Jesus is lost when he's 12, right?
Yes.
And 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 Jesus is the perfect son, and Mary is the perfect mum, right? So we've got an interesting combination here. Um, first of all, Jesus is lost for 3 days in a big city when he's 12. It's not his own hometown, and they don't find him whimpering in a corner or sitting in the police station. He's completely comfortable. I don't know where he lived, but he was completely comfortable. What's it mean? They've raised him to be self-reliant by the time he's 12. What does that say about the way we raise kids when they're 10, 11, 12,
Yes.
Second, Mary does the talking, not Joseph, which I think is interesting, isn't it? That
Yeah.
Joseph, dad doesn't overplay his hand. Dad doesn't come in. Dad doesn't come across as a "What are you doing, boy?" He's much more self-controlled. Um, and what are the two questions that Mary asks? She's the perfect parent, so she's doing what a perfect parent should do, and she's showing us what a perfect parent does. She asks two questions. The first one is, "Why have you done this?" And I'm sure she said with a lot of affection, "Why have you done this?" And the second one is, "Did you know how worried we would be?"
Wow.
And what's the message? The message is the most important value to impart to a teenager is that they are deeply attentive to how their actions affect others.
Yes. Yeah. That's
And
good.
not raising kids to be self, center of the world. No, we're raising kids so that that they're they're deeply attuned to their duties to others, which is the virtual job.
Oh,
Uh,
so good.
it's a big one that. And so how do you do that? You can't educate a young person unless they open their heart to you.
Yes. And you do that
And
through connection.
and they won't open their heart if you don't open your heart.
Mm.
So so this idea of parents talking to their kids one-on-one deeply often is crucial. Otherwise, there's no way you can educate a teenager. How do you know what your kids are doing when they're over at someone's sleepover or if they're on Facebook or something? You don't know what they're doing. Facebook can be a cesspool, right? What do you know? Only if they tell you.
Yes.
And, sure, you can check computer logs and things, but I mean, only that works so far.
Yes, it does. And I think the culture is so seductive. Like at every point, the culture is trying to take kids away from these values and this way of thinking through. I mean,
Mm.
mainly it's through technology, really, social media, phones, technology. I mean, here in Australia, we're seeing them trying to lift the age of being able to be on social media from 13 to 16. But it's so
Still missing
seductive, and
the point, isn't it? Yeah, yeah.
we can't protect our kids because
That's right.
they are in this world. So we can't lock them away. We're not going to be able to protect them. So the focus therefore becomes we need to equip them. And we do that
Yeah.
through character and virtues education.
Yeah, yeah. This is interesting. The last major document that St. John Paul gave us, do you know what it is?
Tell me.
It's a document called Rapid Development, and it's about rapid
Oh,
development
I
technology.
didn't. Okay.
And the last paragraph, he says, "Do not fear the internet. Use it to do good." Isn't that
Wow.
interesting? It's
Yeah.
like the last
Wow.
thing he left us.
Wow. Gosh, he didn't realize how bad it was going to get. Or maybe he did. But
That's an interesting one.
yeah, but I think that one around character, virtues, prudence, temperance, that's where those qualities, those virtues become so important, especially around that online space for young people.
Can we talk about prayer for a minute?
Yes, please. Let's finish up with that because that is the
Good, good,
most important
good,
touchstone for this
good work.
conversation.
The a massive influence on me has been Saint Josemaria Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei, and he said, and he's on paper saying this very clearly, and it's quite an early thing that he made the point, maybe in the 1940s. He said, if we don't raise young people to be souls of prayer, we've wasted our time. And so, how do parents teach their kids to love prayer? That sort of idea is crucial. And you think, well, yeah, hang on. I mean, the sacraments, we've got to get the sacraments right because the sacraments are the sources of grace. And,
Mm.
we've clearly lost the plot often in terms of teaching our Catholic faith because we don't teach kids that sacraments are gold, and that's where we get our strength. Yeah. But the prerequisite for that is that we have a deep personal love for our Lord. So how do you pass on to kids this idea of that we've got to deal with our Lord so deeply and personally? And clearly it comes from mum and dad's example, but
Mm.
there's things that we can do to help ourselves, to sort of develop that conviction too. I love that line in the Gospels where they go up to John the Baptist and they say, "Hey, John, are you the Messiah?" And he says, "No, no, 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 no. I only baptize you with water. The Messiah will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." In other words, God will come to dwell in our souls personally.
Yeah.
It's super, right? Or the first words of St. John. What's the first words of St. John? And also in Peter's first letter, it's the same practically, right? The very first thing they want to tell us. John's got the prologue in his gospel where he talks about in the beginning was the word. And by the time he shifts his focus from the word to us, he says, and to those who accepted him, the word, he gave power to become children of God. So the very first thing he wants to tell us is that we're children of God. And that's the very first thing St. Peter tells us in his first epistle, that don't forget you're children of God. Now, what does that mean? I mean, that means that we've got this deeply personal relationship with God, and that colors everything. And somehow from that conviction comes a very deep attitude that I really have to pay attention to God who's so close to me. I mean, Pope Benedict wrote this beautiful book, God Near Us, to remind us that God's with us, and so the first thing about prayer, I think, is this deep conviction that God's made all this effort to be close to me and he wants to live in my soul. He wants what I want more than I do. Sorry, I love this story. Tim Staples came to Redfield. The first time he spoke in Australia, he spoke at Redfield. Perusia brought him out. And and um, and and at the end of the speech, one of the young guys, it was parents and ex-students he was speaking to, and one of the ex-students, in front of all of his mates, says, "Mr. Staples, that was a fantastic talk. That's my parents over there. I think the world of my parents. I just want to get married. How do I find the girl of my dreams? I just want to find the girl of my dreams. How do I do that? I mean, it
Oh,
was a really good
God bless
question.
him.
But then Tim Staples says, you got to understand. He tells first of all a beautiful story about how he met his wife in really providential circumstances, and then he says, and you got to understand that Jesus wants you to meet the girl of your dreams more than you do.
Oh,
So in other
yeah.
words, God's so close to all of us that he wants what we want, provided it's good for us, right? and
Yes.
he'll help us achieve our goals if they're good for us. So we shouldn't think, oh, the will of God is some sort of abstract thing. No, he wants me to come close to him, kicking all of the goals that I've got in my mind, and do a lot of good in
Mm,
my life.
mm,
Obviously oriented towards others, not just selfishly. But we forget that God's so good. That's the problem.
mm. Yes, no, it is. It is. And I think just that for women, like prayer can be hard to fit into the daily schedule, whether you have little children or whatever it is. But my advice to women is just start small. So even if it's
Starts.
5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, like making time for
Yeah.
prayer, like just one-on-one prayer where you're just receiving from the Lord, but then also the sacraments. We often recommend spiritual direction as well, so that you are just having someone walk with you who can be a spiritual mother or father speaking into your life. All of those things are so important. And then finally, just the community, embedding yourself with a community of like-minded people. We're so blessed. We have two sets of really close friends. There's three couples. Marriages are strong. We get together regularly and we just share faith and life. And it's so
Honestly, yeah.
edifying. And it's been such a
Honestly.
powerful example for our children to grow up in that community of just three couples and their children, but all of the language, the shared values, is so precious. So yeah, it's lovely. Andy, thank you so much for your wisdom. I'm going to put a link in the show notes for people for where they can purchase your book and then the
Great.
workbook as
Thank you.
well. And
Lovely.
yeah, is there anywhere else that people can find you or the work that you do?
Um, I suppose the main thing is through the books. I mean, I
Yes,
teach at University of Notre Dame in Sydney.
yes,
But I teach teachers there. Um,
yes.
and I mean, I'm giving various talks down here, but
Yes, no.
but the books
Well,
are the main
I
thing.
think we'll need to get you back on another episode to just talk about the digital world and navigating teenagers through that. I'd love
Good
some
pleasure, Karen.
advice on that
Good
one.
pleasure. Good on you.
But yeah, Andy, God bless you and thank you so much for being with
Hey,
us.
lovely to talk. Lovely to talk, Karen. See you later.
Thank you. Well, ladies, I hope and pray that you enjoyed that episode. There was so much wisdom that Andy shared. Personally, I felt like I could sit and listen to him for hours just lapping up his wisdom. Can I invite you to check out his book? Even if you're not a parent, I invite you to get a copy and then share it with those people that you do know who are in the midst of parenting young people. The link for his book and the workbook is in the show notes. So please check that out. Make sure you get a copy and then share it with as many people as possible. Towards the end of our conversation, Andy touched on this area of sexuality formation of young people. Jonathan and my core business was in this area and still is in this area. And so can I invite you, if you are interested in resources for your school, for your teachers or for your children, to visit our website, www.choices, with a Z, it's choicez.com.au. Or for tips on parenting in this particular area of sexuality formation and providing your young people with an education in love, you can join us on Instagram, Choices Media. That's CHOICEZ Media. Well, ladies, that wraps up another episode here at the Genius Podcast. I hope and pray that conversation was a blessing. And if you like what you've heard, can I invite you to leave a review and share this episode with your friends? This really helps to support the mission here at the Genius Project. Until next week, have a beautiful week, and I look forward to you joining me again on the Genius Podcast next week.